how we can progress that relationship thereafter. There was some discussion that the two leaders had on the G7. Both agreed on the importance of working together in Africa. Boris Johnson mentioned the issue of climate change and environment, and Prime Minister conveyed to him that we are launching a national campaign against plastic waste in the oceans and against single-use plastic. That was welcomed by him. There was a brief discussion on the situation in the Gulf, on the need to find a new pathway if the JCPOA is not acceptable. And there was also some discussion on Afghanistan, where the two leaders agreed that there was an importance of gaining some clarity on what would happen if and when a deal is signed and announced between the United States and various Afghan groups. There was a brief meeting with the UN Secretary General. As you know, Prime Minister will be going to the United Nations General Assembly next month and participating as one of the keynote leaders and speakers in the UN Secretary General's Climate Change Summit or Climate Summit. Mr. Gutierrez mentioned that he is very enthusiastic about Prime Minister's leadership on climate change. Prime Minister himself spoke of the initiative on single-use plastic. He also took some time to explain his new initiative, which is the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which we hope to launch during Prime Minister's visit to New York next month. And one of the ideas he spoke of in this regard was whether or not the world could come together to create a pool of trained volunteers in a global movement which would help countries recover after a disaster. This was one of the ideas that they spoke about. The Secretary General also expressed concern, of course, over India's thermal power plants in the context of climate change, and Prime Minister explained to him that India is moving towards renewable forms of energy, cleaner forms of energy. In this regard, the Prime Minister referred to nuclear power and said that this is an investment-intensive industry, that therefore the membership of the nuclear suppliers group is crucial to build investor confidence. And the UNSG said that he understood India's position in this regard and that he was willing to help out in this matter. So broadly, the discussions with UNSG focused on Prime Minister's forthcoming participation in the Climate Change Summit, as well as Prime Minister's own initiatives that he intended to take during the Climate Change Summit, including celebrating the 150th anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi, at which the UN Secretary General will also be present in a special function. This morning, Prime Minister had a brief meeting with the President of Senegal. Senegal is a country which is important to us. We have had substantial bilateral relations with them. This was a bilateral meeting at which we discussed how we would develop further cooperation with the West African states, including in renewable energy. We have given 250 e-rickshaws or solar-powered rickshaws to Senegal. The President mentioned this in particular, and in fact told the Prime Minister that subsequent to the trials and tests, a very substantial order would soon be placed for these e-rickshaws. Prime Minister, of course, assured him of support in this as well as in other initiatives. And there was also a brief discussion on the International Solar Alliance. The President of Senegal has told Prime Minister that on all multilateral issues and in all international forums, Senegal stands shoulder to shoulder with India. Just before we came here, the meeting with President Trump has concluded. That was a substantially long meeting. There was, of course, a press conference, and all of you heard the press conference, so I will not go into the details of that, but subsequent to that, there was a 40-minute meeting, and it was principally focused on issues of trade and energy. The Prime Minister spoke of the importance of energy imports from the United States. He referred to the fact that $4 billion worth of imports were already in the pipeline and that we expected to step it up. As you know, Prime Minister will be visiting the United States next month. And in that context, he is going to have a roundtable with the top CEOs of energy companies and in Houston. And in that, the objective there is twofold. One, to see how we can import more energy from the United States. And the second is how we can invest in the energy sector in the United States, or rather how Indian companies can invest in the energy sector in the United States. This was welcomed by President Trump. In fact, President Trump spoke very warmly of the fact that India had become a major importer of energy, and he also indicated that he was willing to send top administration officials down to Houston for this purpose in an effort to ensure that the bilateral energy relationship is progressed. There was also thereafter some discussion on the trade issues. I won't go into details since all of you are aware of what these trade issues are. But as you know, when Prime Minister met President Trump in Osaka, Prime Minister had clearly conveyed that now that Prime Minister has been re-elected, that the election is behind him, that we are now in a forward-looking position on trade issues, and had offered to send our Commerce and Industry Minister Shri Piyush Goyal to Washington. That has not been able to materialize, perhaps because the United States was involved in other negotiations. But Prime Minister reiterated his offer, and he suggested that this was something which we can have a constructive approach to, that both sides should look at it afresh, and that we should move ahead. So essentially, the two leaders have agreed that preferably before Prime Minister's visit to Washington, there will be an interaction between the trade ministers at which we will discuss the whole range of trade issues. So essentially that was the gist of the discussion. It was a very warm meeting, very positive meeting. It followed the discussions that Prime Minister had with President Trump on the telephone the week before. And this is the third either meeting or conversation that the two leaders have had in the about 100 days of office that the Prime Minister has been in his second term. So this was really the gist of the bilateral meetings. The G7 meetings are still on. Prime Minister is the keynote speaker at the moment on the digital initiative. He also spoke about India's initiatives on climate change and global warming. So we go back with a sense of satisfaction, both in the multilateral aspect of this visit and in the bilateral aspect of meetings in Washington, of Prime Minister's very successful visits to the United Arab Emirates and to the Kingdom of Bahrain, the latter for the first time that since independence that a Prime Minister has been there, and a very successful bilateral meeting with President Macron of France a couple of days ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are really running short of time. We have to leave for the airport, and therefore we can't take any questions. Thank you.